The spring of 1945 saw something unprecedented in German military history. An army that had conquered most of Europe now surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. More than 2.8 million German soldiers laid down their weapons on the Western Front alone between D-Day and the end of April 1945. In the 3 to 4 months leading up to the war's end, over 800,000 more surrendered on the Eastern Front. The Ruhr Pocket collapse in April brought the surrender of over 300,000 men in a single encirclement, the largest such capitulation in Western Europe during the entire war. This was the same military force that had crushed Poland in weeks, overrun France in 42 days, and pushed deep into Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht that once seemed unstoppable was now dissolving. The question is not whether Germany lost the war. The question is why its soldiers chose surrender over resistance in numbers that stunned even the Allied commanders who took them prisoner. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The German military philosophy at the war's beginning did not accommodate surrender. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized offensive warfare, rapid breakthrough, and the moral imperative of fighting to the last bullet. The ghost of 1918 haunted German military thinking. Many officers believed that Germany had not been defeated militarily in the First World War, but had been betrayed by collapse on the home front. This narrative shaped Nazi ideology and military training alike. Soldiers were indoctrinated with the idea that surrender was not merely tactical defeat, but moral failure. Propaganda constantly reinforced the concept that German troops possessed superior will and discipline. Early victories seemed to confirm this belief. Between 1939 and 1942, German forces rarely faced circumstances that would test their resolve to the point of mass surrender. When encircled Soviet armies capitulated by the tens of thousands, it reinforced German assumptions about their own superiority. The possibility that German soldiers might one day face the same choice seemed remote, almost unthinkable. But war is not won by doctrine alone. It is won by logistics, manpower, industrial capacity, and the grinding mathematics of attrition. By 1944, those mathematical realities were becoming impossible to ignore. Germany's military reached its peak strength of approximately 12 million personnel around 1943 and 1944. But this peak masked underlying fragility. Divisions that once numbered 15,000 men were being rebuilt with 9,000. Infantry battalions that started the war with over 800 soldiers now fielded 700. The Eastern Front consumed men at a rate the Reich could not sustain. From the start of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 until the end of April 1945, nearly 9 million of Germany's 11 million total military casualties occurred fighting Soviet forces. 80% of all German military deaths happened on the Eastern Front. After the disaster at Stalingrad in February 1943 and the catastrophic defeat at Kursk that summer, the Wehrmacht transitioned from offensive to defensive operations. Replacements grew younger and older simultaneously. The Volkssturm, established in September 1944, conscripted males aged 16 to 60 who had previously been deemed unfit for military service. Old men and teenage boys received minimal training and obsolete weapons. They were expected to hold defensive positions against battle-hardened Allied armies. German divisions increasingly consisted of personnel cobbled together from disparate sources. Luftwaffe ground troops with no infantry training, sailors without ships, factory workers pulled from essential war production. Unit cohesion, the fundamental element of military effectiveness, began to erode. The collapse accelerated when Germany's logistical backbone broke. The Wehrmacht had always faced fuel shortages. Germany possessed virtually no domestic oil reserves. Synthetic fuel plants and access to Romanian oil fields sustained operations. But Allied bombing changed that equation decisively. Beginning in May 1944, the combined bomber offensive systematically targeted Germany's petroleum infrastructure. Refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and storage depots became priority targets. By September 1944, German synthetic fuel production had dropped to 5,000 barrels per day, down from tens of thousands. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Panzer divisions received orders to advance, but had no fuel to comply. Trucks sat immobile. Supply lines depended on horse-drawn carts, the same transportation method used in the First World War. Ammunition shortages grew critical. Artillery units received strict ration limits on shells they could fire. Infantry companies ran low on rifle cartridges, hand grenades, and medical supplies. Food rations shrank. Soldiers who had once eaten adequately now went hungry. The material superiority that German forces enjoyed early in the war reversed entirely. Every German soldier could see American trucks delivering endless supplies. They watched Allied aircraft dominate the skies unopposed. They saw the material abundance of their enemies and compared it to their own deprivation. The industrial gap between Germany and the combined Allied powers became viscerally obvious to the men expected to bridge that gap with willpower and blood. The turning point came not in a single battle, but across multiple fronts simultaneously. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, Germany's vaunted coastal defense system, failed to stop the invasion. German commanders had predicted the landing, but Hitler's interference and strategic confusion prevented effective response. Within weeks, Allied forces broke out of the Normandy beachhead. Paris fell in August. By September, Allied armies approached Germany's western border. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet summer offensive Operation Bagration destroyed Army Group Center. 28 German divisions ceased to exist. 350,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Soviet advance liberated Belarus and pushed into Poland. German forces retreated on all fronts. The defensive lines that might have held for months collapsed in weeks. Soldiers who had been told they were defending Fortress Europe now fought on German soil. That psychological shift mattered. When Wehrmacht troops fought in Russia or France, they were conquering or defending territory far from home. When they fought in East Prussia or the Rhineland, they defended their own towns and families. But the logistical reality made defense impossible. Divisions transferred from the Eastern to Western Front, or vice versa, arrived under strength and exhausted. Fuel shortages prevented tactical mobility. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Allies. German soldiers increasingly faced a choice: fight in hopeless situations or seek a way out. That choice became starkest after the Rhine crossings in March 1945. The Rhine River represented Germany's last natural defensive barrier in the West. Its bridges were demolished, its banks fortified. German propaganda insisted the Rhine could not be crossed. American forces crossed it at Remagen on March 7th, when the Ludendorff Bridge was captured intact before it could be destroyed. Within weeks, multiple Allied armies established bridgeheads. The Ruhr industrial region, heart of German war production, became encircled. Field Marshal Walter Model commanded Army Group B, approximately 300 to 25,000 troops and 30 German generals. They were trapped in a pocket approximately 50 miles wide. Model knew escape was impossible. He also knew Hitler would never permit surrender. So his army disintegrated from within. Soldiers began deserting in thousands. They discarded uniforms, hid in barns and cellars, or walked westward with hands raised. Entire units ceased fighting. By mid-April, the eastern and western halves of the pocket had been split. Organized resistance collapsed. On April 18th, the Battle of the Ruhr ended. Over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered. It was the single largest German capitulation in the West, during the entire war. Field Marshal Model dissolved his command and shot himself, rather than surrender. But his soldiers had already made a different choice. The Eastern Front told a darker story. German troops there faced a different enemy and knew they faced a different fate. Reports of Soviet treatment of German prisoners were widespread, often exaggerated by Nazi propaganda, but rooted in undeniable reality. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses. Nazi occupation policies in the East were exterminationist. Entire villages were burned. Prisoners of war died by the millions in German captivity. When the Red Army pushed into German territory, retribution followed. German soldiers feared capture by Soviet forces with reason. Approximately 3 million German prisoners were taken by the Soviets during the war. Around 1 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, forced labor, or execution. The last German POWs were not released from Soviet camps until 1956, over a decade after the war ended. This fear created a mass movement westward. German units on the Eastern Front sought to disengage and retreat west. Their objective was not to continue fighting, but to reach American or British lines and surrender there. The Ninth Army under General Theodor Busse found itself encircled southeast of Berlin in late April 1945. The pocket contained approximately 80,000 soldiers, remnants of units shattered during the Soviet assault on the Seelow Heights. They attempted a breakout toward the west, toward the German 12th Army, which was itself retreating toward American positions. The Battle of Halbe, fought between April 24th and May 1st, resulted in catastrophic German casualties. Only about 30,000 soldiers successfully broke through Soviet encirclement. 40,000 to 60,000 were killed or captured. The motivation was clear in interrogations of survivors. They were not trying to continue the war. They were trying to reach the Americans. This desperation infected every level of the Wehrmacht by April 1945. Commanders who had once insisted on discipline now tacitly permitted withdrawal or surrender. Officers who enforced strict obedience disappeared or looked the other way. The Nazi Party and SS field police still executed deserters, hanging them from trees and lampposts as warnings, but enforcement became sporadic. The machinery of terror was breaking down along with everything else. Estimates suggest that between 15,000 and 20,000 German soldiers were executed for desertion, cowardice, or defeatism during the war. The rate accelerated in early 1945, but the sheer scale of collapse overwhelmed the apparatus of punishment. For every soldier executed, thousands more slipped away. In Berlin itself, as Soviet forces closed in, Wehrmacht soldiers abandoned positions, discarded weapons, and attempted to blend into the civilian population. The Volkssturm militiamen, many of whom were middle-aged fathers or teenage boys, simply went home. 16-year-olds surrendered, carrying rifles that had last been fired in the First World War. 60-year-old men with World War I medals, pinned to civilian jackets, sat in prisoner of war camps next to hardened SS veterans. The composition of German military forces in the final weeks was a grotesque mockery of the efficient machine that had invaded Poland in 1939. The numbers compiled by the German High Command illustrate the scale of disintegration. In January 1945 alone, over 450,000 German soldiers were killed. Each of the next 3 months saw casualties exceeding 280,000 dead. From January 1st to April 30th, 1945, approximately 1,277,000 German military personnel were killed or went missing. Casualty figures for the final months exceeded the losses of any comparable period earlier in the war, but death was only part of the story. Surrender was the other. More than 2.8 million German troops surrendered on the Western Front between D-Day and the end of April 1945. On May 2nd, approximately 1 million German soldiers in Italy laid down their arms. In the days following Germany's formal surrender on May 8th, millions more entered Allied captivity. The Western Allies found themselves overwhelmed by German prisoners. Temporary camps were erected in open fields. The Rheinwiesen Lager, meadow camps along the Rhine, held hundreds of thousands of disarmed enemy forces in conditions that violated Geneva Convention standards. There were not enough tents, latrines, or food supplies. The Allies had planned for prisoners, but not for this scale of capitulation. The speed of Germany's collapse surprised everyone, including Allied intelligence. Why did so many choose surrender over continued resistance? Fear of Soviet capture drove much of the eastward flight, but that does not explain the mass surrenders in the West. Soldiers interviewed in prisoner of war camps gave overlapping reasons. The war was obviously lost. Continuing to fight meant dying for nothing. Families were more important than ideology. The Nazi promises had been revealed as lies. There was no secret wonder weapon that would reverse the tide. The Führer's orders meant nothing when those orders guaranteed death. Desertion and surrender required abandoning the ideological framework that had sustained the Wehrmacht for years. German military culture emphasized duty, obedience, and sacrifice. Soldiers had sworn personal oaths to Adolf Hitler. Breaking that oath was not merely tactical decision but moral transgression. Yet by April 1945, the moral calculus had shifted. The regime demanding loyalty had sent millions to die for territorial gains that evaporated. The leadership insisting on fight to the last man was safely in bunkers, while teenagers held rifles on the front line. The contrast between propaganda and reality became unbearable. When soldiers realized their commanders no longer believed in victory, when officers stopped enforcing suicidal orders, when the logistical system could no longer provide ammunition or food, the ideological structure supporting continued resistance collapsed. The consequences of this collapse shaped the war's final weeks. In the West, German resistance became sporadic and localized. Cities fell with minimal fighting. Munich surrendered without a battle. Hamburg capitulated intact. In contrast, towns and villages where SS units remained fought bitterly, resulting in pointless destruction. The difference was stark. Where regular Wehrmacht units held positions, they often negotiated surrender to spare civilian casualties. Where fanatical SS or Hitler Youth defenders dug in, entire communities were destroyed. The decision to surrender or resist became a referendum on ideology. Those who still believed in National Socialist rhetoric fought on. Those who no longer believed or who prioritized survival over ideology surrendered. The Western Allies benefited strategically from mass German surrenders. Every German soldier who quit fighting freed Allied troops for other missions. Intelligence gathered from prisoners provided details about remaining German positions, supply status, and morale. The collapse of organized resistance allowed Allied forces to advance faster than logistics could support. The war in Europe ended not with a final climactic battle, but with an exhausted army disintegrating across multiple fronts. The legacy of these surrenders complicated post-war memory. German veterans who surrendered to Western Allies often portrayed their capitulation as pragmatic realism, distinct from ideological fanaticism. They had fought for their country, they claimed, but recognized futility when it came. This narrative conveniently separated military service from Nazi ideology, a distinction the historical record challenges. The Wehrmacht was deeply complicit in Nazi war crimes, particularly on the Eastern Front. Soldiers who surrendered in the final months were not necessarily repudiating Nazism. Many were simply choosing survival. Others surrendered because logistical collapse left no alternative. A soldier without ammunition cannot fight regardless of ideological commitment. Post-war Germany grappled with this complexity. The scale of the surrenders undermined the narrative of German military honor and fighting prowess. If the Wehrmacht was so formidable, Why did millions quit? If German soldiers were so loyal, why the mass capitulations? The answers lay not in personal cowardice, but in systemic collapse. Industrial inferiority, logistical failure, strategic incompetence, and attrition combined to create conditions where surrender became the rational choice. The individual soldier's decision to lay down arms reflected the broader failure of the Nazi state. What history learned from 1945 is that no army fights without supplies, no ideology survives material defeat, and no propaganda can compensate for empty fuel tanks and empty stomachs. The German soldiers who surrendered in the spring of 1945 were not fundamentally different from those who had conquered Europe years earlier. What changed was not morale or courage, but the cold mathematics of industrial warfare. When the logistical base collapses, when the enemy has unlimited fuel and you have none, when your commanders issue impossible orders and punishment for disobedience becomes unenforceable, soldiers make the choice that soldiers throughout history have made. They survive. The mass surrenders of 1945 remind us that wars are not won by will alone. They are won by factories, oil refineries, railroads, and the capacity to sustain armies across continents. Germany lost that capacity. Its soldiers recognized reality before its leaders did. That recognition, more than any battle, ended the war in Europe. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.